So our first panel for our panel afghan is a stockinette stitch in the center of our garter stitch, beginning and end, and the side pieces. And as I said in the previous video, one side will be your the V side, or the knit side, and the next side, the back side, is your purl side. So this is not considered a reversible pattern. Now, but by putting these edges on here, it won't curl. So you could make this if you just want to make an afghan, not the panel afghan, any number of stitches in for your stockinette portion. Now, each panel is made the same way, and I made them all on the small scarf set, and these have 8.5-inch arms. Now I've already put on 15 stitches on here. You'll notice that I'm working with 6 strands. This is more strands than I did on the previous videos with the checkerboard or what was the other one, the chevron. But I wanted my stitch pattern to really show, and I wanted it to be a lot tighter. So this is a very dense fabric. I used 3/4 of each skein, and I worked from 6 skeins at a time, pulling from the center. And I kept 3 skeins on my left and 3 skeins on my right, just helped to keep them from tangling around one another. And if you're careful, that won't happen. So, but these are a lot denser, and so that's part of the fact they take a little while. It took me about 1 hour and 15 minutes for each one. So I used a Slingshot Cast On, and I've already cast 15 stitches onto this side. I'm using the pipe that is equivalent to about a US 19 needle, so that's the beige pipe. If you make it yourself, just go over to where the hot water pipe is at Lowe's. But you know what, if you're making your own stand like these and you're buying these little fittings, you have to buy the pipe at Home Depot. They're different on the inside. We'll buy enough that these won't fit in the Lowe's ones. The Lowe's ones are too loose. Just so you know, buy the Charlotte pipe that has the yellow streak down it, and you'll have to take it all off. But the point being is, I've already put 15 stitches on here, so now I only need 3 more. And if you'll remember, that is taking my tail, what's left of it, you'll need 5 feet for your tail, and put that around your thumb, and take your working yarns and put around your forefinger, and then hold those and go around your pipe, bring your working yarns around, and that's 16, and you need 18 stitches. Now, you'll notice that on this short pipe, your back stitch will come off this rear. But if you knit this as I do, they're not going to keep falling over. They'll just slip over the back, and let it, otherwise you won't have enough room. These are only 8.5 inches long. So, now you've got 18 stitches on, and you are going to knit your first 6 rows in garter stitch. So you need your stitch counter, a row counter, and after your 6th row, you'll need your little stitch markers. But we're just going to pretend. So we're only going to work 2 rows, and then I'll show you about putting the stitch markers on. So you remember that in order to do garter stitch, we have to, and what I like to do is always front stitch my odd number row, so that would be row 1. And we're not going to do a slip stitch edge this time. We want those nubs, because that's how we're going to sew it all together. So make sure you have only your 6 working yarns. Now, if you are a very tight knitter, you might only need 5 strands. If you're a very loose knitter, you might want smaller pipe. So, I see I dropped that guy. Make sure you have them all. I looked away for a moment. So you want to make sure that you have all 6 strands, that they're loose. So just check your gauge. You want this to be tight enough that you can distinguish the stitch. And as you work along, if you're working on the mini set, you want to make sure you can push that up through if you want to get your stitches. The first row is always harder, remember, because that's your cast on row. Don't make your cast on row too tight. And again, we're working from the right to the left. It's an odd number row, and when I'm doing garter stitch, I make these all as front stitches. Remember, don't get confused. If you're a knitter and you're used to working on straight needles, we make garter stitch by alternating stitches between the front and back stitches between odd and even rows. Every other row. This last one will be tricky because that's your slip knot. Just reach through however you can there and grab them. Oops, I don't think I got them all. Let's do it again. I'm sitting off to the side again, so my angle's a little strange. Alright, there you go. So, now we do row 2. This has to be back stitch. So, just like always, we want to take the yarn up, the working yarns, and take the stitch off, and put it on your finger. And I think it's easier to just then reach in. I have the working yarns against my other finger, and I pull them through like so, snug that down a little bit, and pipe it. This time you're doing all back stitches because you're working from the left to the right. And you want to make sure as you move the stitches up, you're going to have to pull, if you're working on the mini set, pull that last stitch back up over the edge of the pipe because there's a drop off there between that and the angle, the corner. I think it's easier to do when it's this many strands and it's very thick like this. It's easier to not drop them if I kind of work them underneath the pipes. But whatever works for you. Now you would do this for 6 rows or 3 garter stitch ridges. Oops. Get on there. And once it gets pretty full, you're going to have to be careful that you don't pull all of your stitches off. Let me bring this through. Now look what I did here. Way back here. I made a little boo-boo. See this? I dropped a stitch. One of the strands. So this is how you fix this. This is very common to do in the first couple of rows. Take your stitch off. Put it back where it belongs. And I did that as a back stitch. Watch, be aware of that when you're knitting with 6 strands like this. If you want to knit with something else, again, I use this Caron 1-pound yarn. This is inexpensive when it's on sale. You know, $5-6 for a whole pound of, skein. But it's all acrylic. If you want to work with something else like woolies, you could probably get away with 2 or 3 strands. When you're working with 6, it gets a little more, it's a little easier to drop one. So you want to keep checking and make sure that you haven't dropped any of your strands. So let's pretend that we have already knitted our first 6 rows. We're about to start the 7th row, but we're going to say it's not the 7th row. We're going to say it's row 1 because our pattern section is 12 stitches across and it's 24 rows long. So what we want to do is, as a signal to ourselves, let's pretend we're going to start this pattern section now. So we want to make our garter stitch border, so we need to start with 3 stitches, and those are going to be 3 front stitches because we're working from right to left. So there's 1. Notice how by the way, how my yarn is starting to twist around here a little bit. The way you eliminate that is just twist it a little bit more. Now do your second. And now do your third. Now, the fact that I've had these yarns separated kind of signaled me to the fact that was starting to twist around, and I've already fixed it. So be aware of that when you're knitting with these many strands. So now I have 3 garter stitches. Now I want to put my stitch marker on. And now I'm beginning my 12 stitch pattern section. So I'm going to do front stitches. Well, I'll do the front stitches all the way down the row, but for my pattern section, I want 12 front stitches. You don't have to make them real tight, but you want enough firmness in your knitting so that your pattern shows. I put these little legs on here today. I hope that's showing up. Okay. And we do one more for our 12 stitch section, and now put on your stitch marker. And now do the other 3 for your garter stitch section. You're going to have to give it a push if you're working on short rods. So that is your first row of your pattern section. So now we begin row 2, and we do 3 back stitches for our garter stitch section. So there's 1, 2, 3, move the stitch marker, and now remember, to make stockinette stitch we either have to do all front stitches or all back stitches. Now I do mine as front stitches because front stitches are easier to do, but that means that the front of the work will be away from you as you knit. Remember, the back of the work will be facing out. Make sure you have all the strands for that last stitch up on the pipe. And again, continue down your row. You see how much faster you can go with front stitches. So when I'm working a pattern, I almost always say, well, in this pattern, when I transpose it, when I see the initial K, which says to knit, I'm going to front stitch that. But not always. Sometimes I do it the reverse. It just depends on the pattern, whether I'm working in the round or whatnot. And as you get better about transposing patterns and you're only working with knits and purls, just remember it doesn't really matter. It's just what matters is what the determination is of what you choose, whether to use, to purl your front stitches or, purl your back stitches, is what side of the fabric will be facing you as you work, if that makes sense. Okay, so I've done all our 12 pattern section. Move your stitch marker, and now we have to do these 3 as back stitches because this is our garter stitch border on the edge. That last one, make sure you don't drop that. And then you're ready for row 3, and it's just what we did on row 1. So we do our 3 stitches for our garter stitch edge, and we do those as front stitches. And your stitch marker gets moved over, and you do your pattern row. And again, just keep those as front stitches. Now some of these, a couple might slip off the back as you're working. Just pull them back up. Now, when you really pack the stitches on like this, it's easy for these to get crossed up. So make sure you have them all the strands. Notice how much tighter these are when I'm working with 6 strands and I'm working on this US 19. And again, your experience might vary from mine. You might, like I say, if you weren't used to pulling your stitches very tightly, you might only need 5 strands, depending on the yarn you're working with. But this yarn is nice for Afghans because there's no dye lot the color never changes, and it's nice because it's easy to wash. But many people don't want to work with acrylic yarn anymore. So, whoops, there goes my stitch marker. Get back here. Okay. Now, you would do this for 24 rows, doing your garter stitch border, your 12 stitch stockinette in the middle, and work for 24 rows, and then you would do 6 more rows of garter stitch for your edge. Now here's the back side. Again, that's facing the outside, in a sense, towards you, and the inside is your stockinette. Now, you can see here's your garter stitch border. Here's your first row of your 2 garter stitches. That's considered one ridge. So sometimes when you read a knitting pattern, it'll tell you to count ridges and not, because that's an easier way to count. And here's your stockinette stitch section. Now let's say you made a mistake, or you just want to make sure you didn't in a more complicated pattern. It is hard to stretch out when you don't have much space. So don't forget that you can take, and to me, a pencil works just as well as anything else. There's a little space in here on the sets that I made. Inside there is that little dowel rod, don't forget. And I like to just take this pencil, rather than, I mean, you can do something long, but that's almost too long in this case. You can take this pencil and just hold it against you while you take these off. Scoop this up. Keep the pencil in there, don't let it fall. And you can stretch out and see what you got. And if I had made a boo-boo and wanted to tear out, and I'd gone all the way up into here, and I'd made a mistake in this section, take this thing now and just lay it on the floor, the whole, you know, unless the arm can come off easily. I don't try to take these arms off while I'm knitting, but I will literally just unbend all of this and let it lay down. And then you can take this pencil, or you can take your long knitting needle and move your stitches onto that while it's laying down, and you can rip out row by row. So let's pretend I'd made a mistake up in here, way up in here. And I thought, I made so many mistakes, it's too hard to figure out. I just want to rip it down to my stockinette section. So all you have to do is, because these stitches are bigger, they're not loose like we're used to working, you know, don't be afraid to do this. You know, take out your pencil, because that pencil would help you get those back on if you were just looking. So now I've got my stitching here, my knitting. And I wouldn't do this if I was this close to my knitting, but if I was way up in here. And don't worry about your stitch markers, take those out. And if I pull these carefully, and let's get Mr. Long. Okay, is that showing up, Joe?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if I take my yarn now, these are my working yarns. Let's pull these back up here. Usually I do this on the floor so it's flat, but I want to try to show you this because I think it can be very frustrating to knit if you've made a mistake and you can't fix it. So now let's say now I want to pull out these stockinette rows, okay? And I want to just come back to my 6 rows of garter stitch. So carefully pull this out. And notice how these stitches are staying there. It's almost like, you know, somebody pressed them into place. And they sort of did. But, you know, they're more fragile than they appear. So now take out the next row. And you ask yourself, well, gee, am I down to my stockinette or my garter stitch section or not? Well, I know when I finish a garter stitch section, and I have finished my even number row, my 6th row in this case, I should be back onto my right pipe. And that means my working yarn should be at the very front on the right hand side. So I know that this is still a row that was part of the stockinette row, and I want to take that out. So pull that, and when you do, that's going to be sure you're right here now. Get your needle. Now pull out the next one and put it on. Get the stitch right then, because you want to make sure you don't drop any of those. Okay, so one by one, we are pulling out. We are going to take our needle and put it in there. Something smaller is better than something that's the same size. And you want to make sure it's long enough for all the stitches. You could even hold the base of the stitch, because this is where you can mess up. And notice how, and I hope that's showing up, as I'm pulling this out, I'm holding the base of the stitch, if you want to even think of it that way. And pull out the next one and put it on your needle. Notice that I'm putting it on like that. In other words, I'm going in the front of the stitch, not the back of the stitch, if you get my meaning. Let me take out the next one, I'll show you what I mean. Don't put it on like that. But if you do, and you make a mistake, you'll know it as soon as you try to knit it the next time, because it'll be twisted. So don't panic. If you put them on the wrong way, you'll know when you try to knit them, and just turn them before you knit them. So now here comes the next one. And if you do this one by one, as you go along, then you can save yourself a whole lot of work on the first, rather than pulling out all the way to the beginning. Now some people knit in what's called a lifeline, and you can do that too. And you can find that on the internet. They'll put a contrasting piece of yarn in with their other knitting. Now watch, they're not going to fall off the end over here. You got to keep an eye on that, because there's a lot of stitches here. They're bulky, that's what I'm saying. Now you get to this last one. This is the tricky one, of course, because this is where your stitch gets turned. So as you're pulling out that working yarn, you want to make sure that you take, see, I actually pulled that out too far. So put it back in. See, it should look like that. If it doesn't look like that, you pulled out too much. Okay? Now, because I use this little tiny thing, there's a reason I use this. Now, lay that down and get your stand back. And we know now that we want to put that on the right hand side. This is a little awkward trying to show you this. Like I said, I normally do this on the floor. So now I have this end. Here's the pointy end. This is where I finished. And I know it has to go on this side. So I'm going to stick that in there. It's kind of pushed up against that little 3/8 inch dowel rod. What size is this? This is a 6. Or is that a 9? I can't read the words on the side. I'm not sure what this is, to tell you the truth, because I can't, even with these glasses, I can't read the writing on it. Okay, so anyway, put it like this inside the pipe. And then one by one, you're just going to slide them back on. Make sure you have it all. And I'm just holding the tip against my chest, to hold it in place. You could do this on the floor, but this is just as easy. And then, just don't poke yourself. You don't want any puncture wounds during knitting. That would be notice how I'm just kind of stretching this out a little bit. Oops, make sure I got them all. Now sometimes you're going to find out you don't have all the strands too. They might want to cross up a little bit, so just take your time. This is a good thing to practice. It's a little time consuming. This is exactly what it is when you're doing it. And you go, ugh. But it's easier than re-knitting 6 rows of. Got a little cross up here. What's going on? Here we go. See how they want to just sometimes kind of cross themselves. And make sure you got them all. 6 strands is a lot. This afghan would work up very cute in woolies, thick and quick too. You probably could get away with 2 or 3 strands. And then that's easier to keep track of. But I think it looks really cute in this yarn too. And this is one of my favorite colors in this. Soft gray mix, it's called. Now, when you get up to about there, they need a little more pushing. But, you know, try not to injure yourself with the tip of the knitting needle is all. Okay. That's easier than re-knitting 6 rows. And then you'll know as you go to knit. Now, let's say you had to start all that over. And now you just begin where you were before. If you take that off and it doesn't look right, then you know you've done something wrong. You'll have to make a... It's easy to tear out too much when you get to those edge stitches because of how we're not slip stitching that. So, and again, you would just start your stockinette then all over if that's where you goofed up or whatever your pattern section was. So I hope that helps in terms of starting and finishing. And now you've got 1 panel done, 8 to go. Thanks for watching.